I want you to deliver a message for me. Tell them he is coming back.
No, no, no!
Cry, little sister. The Legion requires fresh blood.
Dean Meadows writes, directs and stars in Dracula, Rise of the Vampire. And this is a 2026 low-budget, clearly, vampire movie. And there seems to have been a few vampire movies based on Dracula over the last year or so. Dracula obviously existing in the public domain, so anyone really can make a movie based on Dracula. Now, the reason why I was interested in watching this was actually because it stars Eileen Daly. That name might not be familiar to some, but at one time Eileen Daly threatened to become a screen queen here in the UK. She was in her own vampire movie called Razorblade Smile, but she was also the face of the Redemption Video label that kind of put out a lot of kind of exploitation films and things like that. She could do all the modelling for that. So she was kind of a little bit of a horror icon for a short time back a few years ago, and I was kind of interested to see her in this. She actually lives on the south coast of England, not far from where I am actually. So, and this movie was actually filmed in Devon, I believe, which is on the south coast. So let's talk about it. What is this movie? So it's a modern day film where we have a group of cultists want to resurrect Dracula. And they are led by Elizabeth Bathory, who is played by Eileen Daly. And they are doing a variety of kind of murders and stuff to bring about the return of Dracula. And standing against them is Dean Meadows' ex-cop, who has had some type of experience in the occult and things like this. And he and a couple of serving police officers are determined to try and thwart this cult's plan to bring back Dracula. What will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So, let's talk about it. Now, this is a very, very low budget movie, and it is clearly inspired by the kind of the Hammer movies. And, you know, Dracula films as a whole, but in particular the Hammer movies. And there's a lot of references to this. But it is a very, very low budget movie, and as such it has limitations. Let's just say that. But let's talk about what works in this movie's favour. So let's talk about the story first of all, because there are some story elements here that I actually quite liked. The bulk of this movie is less about Dracula himself, who doesn't appear until into the second half of the movie. But it's more about this cult who are kind of doing devil worshipy type stuff and are wanting to bring about the second coming of Dracula, basically, for their nefarious means. And I actually found this to be the most interesting part of the movie, because it's kind of like the thing about this film which sets it apart from many kind of Dracula movies, because it's the kind of the original idea here. And I found this kind of group of cultists that are worshipping Dracula quite an interesting idea. And not only that, I think it goes one step further when even in this cult itself there's actually a division. There's kind of like two separate factions within this cult that are actually kind of like vying for control. So I actually found the idea of that to be quite interesting. So there's a reasonable amount kind of going on there, and in a way this movie didn't have to do that. It could have just really just done a Dracula movie and that would have been it. But I actually found the inclusion of this kind of this cult element to be quite interesting idea, and they're led by the Elizabeth character played by Eileen Daly, and she is absolutely chewing the scenery, giving the most camp performance you'll see this side of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And it's quite a lot of fun. It's very over the top, but it's a sort of like fun, fabulous kind of performance that is both kind of kinky but also overtly silly. So I kind of quite liked it, and she calls everyone darling and everything like this, and it's kind of endearing, to be honest. But there's lots of references to Elizabeth Bathory. It's unclear if she's meant to be the actual Elizabeth Bathory, who would, in that case, be very, very old. Let's just put it like this. But she's not a vampire, so there's a little bit of kind of like with the timeline, but whatever. We'll touch on it again. But I still kind of liked her character. So and there is this kind of campiness through the movie. It's kind of low budget. It's not kind of low budget. It's actually very low budget. But it has this kind of like seaside panto charm. I don't know if anyone outside the UK might not understand what I mean by that. So a kind of like silly, over-the-top pantomime style aesthetic to it, which gives it this sort of cheesy, silly feel that is so overtly camp and odd and just silly. It ends up being sort of amusing. Maybe not 100% intentionally, but nonetheless there's some kind of entertainment value to be had there. So there is that. Dean Meadows, who plays our good guy, our ex-cop, is like in a different movie, because his character is played more straight, and I found his character kind of interesting. And to be fair, his more grounded character, for the most part, probably the most grounded performance, you might say, but he comes across as a little bit like, and again this might be a reference that anyone outside of the UK might not know, but like Phil Mitchell from the TV soap opera EastEnders. So like Phil Mitchell doing an impression of Jason Statham. It's kind of bizarre, but at the same time, again, it's kind of funny. So if you want to see someone like Phil Mitchell doing an impression of Jason Statham, here it is. So this has some unintentional kind of like amusement value, entertainment value, I suppose. So there's that. In the stories, to be fair, the story tries to have a few twists and turns, a few reveals. And there's quite a lot of actual cast members here. It's quite a large cast. I would presume friends and family of Meadows, one would imagine. But there is nonetheless a relatively large cast here, and it culminates in a kind of battle between a bunch of vampires and a bunch of humans, of mostly cops and things. There's actually a few kind of fight scenes in it. The first one, which is kind of like a group of these cultists versus Dean Meadows' ex-cop, relatively well choreographed, I thought. Some of the ones later on, not so much, but there you go. This one fight scene was alright. And one thing which is a double-edged sword here, if you're a fan of Dracula movies, and again, as I say, particularly the Hammer movies, you'll appreciate some of the references in this movie. Throughout the film, they try and name drop a lot of kind of like names of films, of Dracula, like Hammer films and things, and kind of references in the dialogue. So it's kind of like a bingo where you can kind of like, tick them off as they kind of are being read out. So some people might enjoy those references and kind of find it quite fun. But let me transition to what doesn't work. And I'm going to just stay with that point as it's fresh in my mind. So this movie has all these kind of name drops, and they try to incorporate all this kind of like these references into the dialogue. But the dialogue, because of that, sometimes feel very unnatural, because it's trying to jam in all these kind of like these name drops in general kind of conversation, and it just makes the dialogue here feel really sort of forced at times. So that's the downside of that. So, little minor problem there though, but some people might enjoy that. What's the main problem here? Okay, let me just address what I think is going to be easily the biggest problem that I would imagine with this film. The acting. And this is a two-part problem. The acting in this movie is very amateurish from a large portion of the cast. As I say, we've got some performers like Eileen Daly, who I think is somewhat intentionally kind of going very over the top. And then we've got Dean Meadows' character, who, if you had to look at an acting performance, you could arguably say it's probably the strongest, probably the most realistic type in regards to his line delivery and stuff. But at the same time, you just feel like he's trying to channel Jason Statham, but comes across more like Phil Mitchell. But they still have their problems. I mean, like I said, they seem a little bit cartoonish in some respects. But the acting generally is particularly sort of noticeably rough for a lot of the performances. Maybe some better than others, but a large portion of the acting here is quite weak. And I think the problem here is doubled down when there is clearly some low budget ADR that has been added over the top. So a lot of the lines feel like they've been re-recorded and then put over the original, video. And as such, you get this kind of extra layer of not very good acting, because obviously you've got people recording their lines in a booth over the kind of like the action that was filmed on location. So the acting there is just kind of like extremely kind of like clunky and wooden sounding. And again, I would presume here that a lot of the people in this movie aren't actors by trade. They are probably friends. Maybe they've done a little bit of local theatre here and there. But it ain't great, let me just kind of say that. That, to me, is going to be the biggest problem. So, but let me just kind of go through some of the other ones. Just the low budget feel of this, I think, kind of would hurt anyone who wants anything other than a kind of a low budget B movie. It's a very sort of cheap aesthetic all the time. Actually, one going back to one positive, actually, I would say there's actually a relatively couple of sequences where you see some reasonable prosthetic wounds and gore. Nothing, it's not a particularly gory film, but there's a couple of scenes where I think, oh, do you know what, those prosthetics weren't bad. But just the general presentation overall, like when we see Dracula, and he doesn't turn up until over halfway of the movie. The guy they've got, I think they've cast him because he looks a little bit like Christopher Lee, but he's kind of got this thick accent, which really doesn't, and it's not like a Transylvanian accent, let me just put it like that. I don't know, it's not, he just comes across as like an old guy, an older gentleman, and really not threatening. And the costume kind of looks like a Dracula costume you would have got from a Halloween joke shop. It ain't good. It ain't good. And he never really comes across as particularly threatening or anything like that. And as I say, it has this kind of like campy vibe, but I don't always think it's necessarily trying to be campy. Some of the other kind of the vampire kind of henchmen and stuff, again, they're just downright silly. I think the movie, although I do like some of the kind of the story ideas, I do think it's a little bogged down by trying to have too many characters and things to do. It's trying to introduce so many kind of elements to this film. Like I say, you've got Dracula, you've got, Elizabeth Bathory, and it's like not really clear how she would be Elizabeth Bathory. She's not actually a vampire, she's just a human. And then so the timeline doesn't really make sense. And then there's kind of things like Dracula. It's hundreds of years since he was kind of like defeated, but they're referring to Dracula like he was there a couple of decades ago. So the timelines all are kind of a little bit wonky, and it doesn't really kind of make sense. Doesn't feel like it's particularly kind of like well thought out in a kind of like chronological kind of way and things like this. There's some elements here of the story that I didn't think were misjudged. For example, we have a descendant of Van Helsing, and it kind of implies that that's the only person that can genetically kill Dracula. I'm thinking, and it just, you know, results in a bit of stake through the heart. I think, well, anyone could do that, surely. You don't need to be genetically related to someone. It just seems like ridiculous. Like, so I think there are some elements like the Van Helsing thing they could have just not had, and it probably would have made the story a little bit more palatable. I mean, I actually I like the idea where they try to kind of going a little bit of an original direction rather than kind of doing a modern retelling, low budget retelling of Dracula. But I think, you know, do it, have Dracula in it, but they do sort of your own thing. I think try to have in these kind of like legacy characters like Van Helsing. It just, I don't know, it didn't really work for me, that, to be honest with you, as a story idea. The movie's a little on the slow side, I have to say. It's a little bit low energy. I mentioned I quite like one fight scene, but then I think there's like two others, and they are not, well, one of them's like, well, one of them in a pub is ridiculously, I mean, it's sort of played for laughs, but I don't know, but it's just silly. And I think these tonal shifts, you know, shit will get off the pan. Are you a campy, silly movie, or are you sort of semi-serious? It doesn't really feel like it wants to make up its mind about the tone of the film, because in some scenes it's sort of taking itself a little more seriously. The characters are meant to be a bit more grounded, but then some of the scenes are so over the top. It's like, well, I don't really know how you're supposed to take this movie to a degree. And it's worth repeating, this is such a low budget film. I don't think, you know, it's going to change anyone's mind who is on the fence about, are you a B-movie fan? So, how to rate this one? Look, I have to say with a critical mind, this is not a good movie, but I will say there's some entertainment value to be had if you like watching sort of, you know, movies that are a bit, you know, a little bit wee, a little bit sort of like not so good. But critically speaking, you know, it's a 3 out of 10. It's not a good film. It's a subpar film, but in that respect, you might even enjoy it. Is what I would say. 3 out of 10. What were your thoughts? Leave me comments, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
To become immortals, subscribe to the Geek Legion of Doom.